Welcome back to the program. You're watching Daily Politics on Trust TV. Now, the crisis plaguing Nigeria's oil and gas sector shows no sign of abating despite the federal government's directive to sell crude oil to the Dangote Refinery in Naira. Concerns are mounting over the alleged failure of crude oil suppliers to meet domestic obligations as outlined in the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021. Now, in a recent development, the management of Dangote Petroleum Refinery and Petrochemicals refuted claims by the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission that it had facilitated the delivery of 29 million barrels of crude oil to the refinery. This standoff escalates amid allegations by Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man and the founder of the Dangote Refinery, who has accused oil mafias of sabotaging the $19 billion refinery project. Adding another layer to the controversy, renowned investigative journalist David Hundeyin has exposed an alleged attempt by an independent non-profit organization, Dialogue Earth, to mobilize a smear campaign against the 650,000 barrels per day Dangote refinery, the largest, by the way, in Africa. According to Hundeyin, the NGO offered him $500 to write an article questioning the refinery's alignment with Nigeria's climate goals and the broader implications of increased fossil fuel utilization in the country. To delve deeper into this unfolding issue, we're joined virtually by investigative journalist and author David Hundeyin. David, good evening, and thank you most kindly for joining us on Daily Politics.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Right, a lot of Nigerians obviously hearing me mention the figure, $500, would probably be thinking, what was your motivation for turning them down? Was it out of patriotism? Or was it? Why didn't you want to partake in the smear campaign against Dangote?
So it's not uncommon for commissioning editors from whatever organization to reach out to a journalist, asking the journalist to pen some opinion column or editorial or whatever. I've been approached several times to do such work. If it aligns with the opinion that I hold, I do it. If it's not aligned, there are a couple of times I've been asked, for example, to go write some opinion about something that has little to do with me. So say Israel versus Palestine or something, and I decline it because it doesn't align with me. But I don't necessarily go public with that. Why I decided to go public with this one is that I could see very clearly when the brief was sent to me, and I shared screenshots from the brief publicly, that the purpose of this article wasn't just like a random opinion column about the refinery and how maybe the refinery doesn't fit into Nigeria's climate goals. It was much more sinister than that. The NGO that sent this assignment to me, they're a British NGO. It was the Africa office, which is based in Nairobi, that sent me this assignment. And I could tell from the way the brief was worded, it wasn't worded like a normal brief. It was very, very detailed. This is what we want you to write. This is how we want you to word it. These are the resource people we want you to speak to. This is how so-and-so should be framed. This is how so-and-so should be worded. And this is the so-and-so conclusion, pretty much, that should be reached. And the goal of that article, or the perceived goal of that article, was to create a narrative surrounding the very validity of this refinery, that essentially this refinery should not exist based on Nigeria's own stated climate goals and the agreements that Nigeria has signed up to, be the COP28 or the Paris Climate Accords and all of that. And then most insidiously of all, most importantly of all, that the face that should be seen putting this opinion into the public should be a local face. It should be a Nigerian face, right? Because clearly they already knew exactly what it is that they were trying to say, right? Because a normal brief, they give you a lot of leeway to determine what you want to say. This one, there was no leeway. Everything they want you to say has already been specified. So they could easily have got some ghostwriter to do it. They could have put it out under their own name. They could have easily sponsored it in the Nigerian media. They didn't do that. They wanted a known Nigerian face, a local face, to put his name on it and then be the one who seems to be the one putting that opinion into the public. So people will read this thing and think that, okay, this is what David Hundeyin thinks about Dangote Refinery. Meanwhile, it's not. It's what some guy in London thinks, who has paid David Hundeyin to put David Hundeyin's name on it, right, which I mean, there's no way you look at that situation and think, okay, this is perfectly fine. There's nothing to see here. This is fine and dandy, and I should go ahead with this. So I went public. So I said, I I didn't even feel like I need to explain this to Dialogue Earth. That's the name of the NGO. I didn't even like reject it and be like, I'm not doing it. I just went public with it. That this is what this NGO sent to me, and this is what they're trying to do. And being that job, I'm actually a project manager in the energy space. So I actually work in the renewable energy space. So I have a sort of bird's eye view of this very issue. When it comes to this constant debate between fossil fuels and renewables, Africa doesn't have any place in that debate. That's the truth, because Africa contributes less than 4% of global carbon emissions. Africa suffers from energy poverty. So the problems that those who have coal power stations and whose air forces and armies generate more emissions than the whole of the continent of Africa, the problems that those people have nothing to do with the problems that we have, right? Our basic problem is poverty, and poverty is caused in the modern world by lack of industrialization, lack of industry. And the two things you need for industry to become a thing in an African context are, number one, energy, number two, steel. It's as simple as that. Without energy and steel, you can't industrialize. So why on earth would anyone come to Africa and start telling Africans that we shouldn't do anything at all that is within our power to increase our energy security, being that the so-called renewable energy, even though a lot of it is still sort of airy-fairy, doesn't really exist, right? Even the so-called renewables, the technology that does exist, a lot of it is very expensive and very unreliable. It's not within our budgets. It's not within our purview. What we do have in Africa is a lot of cheap hydrocarbon energy reserves, a lot of it, right? So why on earth would we not be allowed to make use of our own energy reserves? And then after we've industrialized, we can then start talking about doing an energy transition. Energy transition is you are transitioning from one type of energy to another. Not that you are on zero, you don't have any energy, and someone is asking you to do an energy transition. Transition from what? So that's the problem here, where I see a lot of foreign eyes and foreign sensibilities and foreign opinions making their way into our local discourse in Nigeria and in Africa. And our problems are not their problems. Right. But the unfortunate thing about civil society, as I'm sure you're aware, is that because civil society is almost entirely funded from abroad, it's funded from Europe, it's funded from the US, it's funded from the UK, it's funded from basically the developed world.
Yeah, let me pick you up on that.
Basically,
let me pick you up on that, because earlier in the day you tweeted, Dear African Organized Private Sector, the reason that your operating environment is always trying to kill you and you struggle to grow despite having a market of 1.4 billion of the world's youngest people is because nearly all of the think tanks, the policy research institutes, civil society organizations, and media in Africa are owned, funded, directed, or controlled by external actors who are trying to kill you. Talking about local private sectors operating in Africa. You say that the growth of the private sector in Africa and their success is not the interest of those international actors. Put it in layman's terms, especially as it relates to the conversation we're having right now with the Dangote Refinery, because most Nigerians, since the Dangote Refinery came on board, were thinking, listen, the promises were made that is going to be the panacea or part of the solution going forward about our energy crisis, especially as far as the cost of petroleum is concerned. Now, this drama is unfolding right before our eyes, even involving government regulatory agencies that belong to us here in Nigeria. So help us square the circle around how these international interests and government regulatory agencies are all a part of this problem that you're talking about.
So there are three major interests to look out for here. The first are the international private interests, and by this I mean the international oil companies and oil refiners. Now, as you know, Dangote Refinery is by far the biggest refinery in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. Refinery, the next largest one, I believe, is in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. I think that's about 400,000 barrels a day. It's owned by Shell. Dangote Refinery, by virtue of its size, has something that the economists call economies of scale, which means the more you can produce, the cheaper you are able to offer your product. So in an industry like refining, which is very high volume but low margin, every extra dollar of margin that your efficiency allows you to create is a very big deal. In addition to being larger than its competitors, it's also much newer than them. So its technologies are much more up to date, and it's able to refine much more efficiently than its competitors. So I was speaking to a contact at Vitol. Vitol is one of the world's largest oil trading companies last week. And this contact told me that by the time Dangote Refinery comes fully on stream, it's currently doing about 400,000 barrels a day. By the time it hits its peak, which is 650,000, that at least 2 oil refineries in Europe are going to go out of business. So essentially, you're going to have a player on the west coast of Africa eating the lunch of business entities in Europe, right? So bear in mind that this is something that has basically, in the 5 or 6 centuries of interaction between Europe and West Africa, the economic relationship has only been in one direction. It has been Europe eating Africa's lunch for 5 or 6 centuries. For the first time, an African player is about to start out competing European players, and they're really not happy about this. So that's the first thing. So those people are not happy with it. Then, in addition to them, you have the wider Western government and economic establishment, which very much likes Africa exactly. Africa's poverty is a bonanza for them, right? And here's what I mean by that. So most African countries like Nigeria, the basic economic model that they have is that they export raw materials cheaply, and then they import finished products at a premium, which means that because you are always spending more than you make, because the raw materials you export, you are not the one who sets the price. It's the people who buy it who set the price for you. That means that your currency is constantly depreciating, which is why in my lifetime, I turned 34 this year. In my lifetime, I have never seen the Naira appreciate before. It has never happened in my lifetime. In my lifetime, the Naira has only depreciated. For most of us, that has been our experience. It's by design, because we import more than we export, right? That's the basic economic problem that most of Africa faces. Now, what a Dangote refinery would do in the case of Nigeria is that it will make it such that for the first time in maybe post-colonial African history, there will be a large African economy that actually produces more than it consumes. Because bear in mind that imported fuel is Nigeria's single largest foreign expense, which is incredible because Nigeria is also one of the world's largest energy exporters, and yet Nigeria suffers from energy poverty. So by removing that expense and making it such that Nigeria is only exporting crude oil and refined petroleum products, that has already reversed that economic dynamic, which has always been of benefit to Europe and the US. When that happens, it has several other knock-on effects for industry across Africa. Bear in mind that where you have primary industry, so the 3 levels of industry: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is where you are exporting raw materials and cash crops. Secondary is where you're manufacturing. Tertiary is where you're doing services. So most of Africa is primary economy, right? Like Nigeria. So the thing with primary economies is that because they only export raw materials cheaply, those in the secondary and tertiary economies benefit from them because they get to set the prices of those raw materials. And then as they move up the value chain, they're adding layers of profit for themselves that we do not benefit from. So if you buy an iPhone today, for example, most of what goes into the iPhone, the materials, they are mined in DR Congo and in places like Kogi State, right? The lithium and the tantalite and the cobalt or whatnot. But we don't see any economic benefit from those things. The people who see the benefit from those things are the company in China, Foxconn, which brings all those parts together and manufactures the iPhone, and then the retailer in the US that sells to American consumers. So they sell an iPhone to an American consumer for $1,000, but maybe Africa, where everything that went into the iPhone came from, Africa makes maybe $50 or $100 out of that 1,000. So where primary production to secondary production, because Dangote Refinery is secondary production, what that means is that we're no longer selling those raw materials cheaply. That means we're moving up the value chain, which means that those who benefit from that value chain that we are excluded from presently, they have less to work with. So literally our prosperity is going to be other people's poverty, and our poverty is other people's prosperity.
Right.
So that's the sort of paradox that we exist in. That's the problem. Right. That's why some people are not happy with it. Yeah. And then, of course, you have within the Nigerian government, you have people who, unfortunately, are being, I don't want to use the term controlled, but are being heavily influenced by external actors. So you have people in the Nigerian government, powerful people in the Nigerian government, who are not acting in the interests of Nigeria as a sovereign entity, because they have other economic interests that are controlling them from outside the country. So then you then have issues like where I think it was the NUPRC spokesperson who came out a few weeks ago and made a few comments that were incredible for a regulator to make about a private business in Nigeria. So he said one person shouldn't control the energy market of 200 million people, which is true. But it shouldn't be the regulator saying that, because it almost sounds like he's a competitor complaining about Dangote Refinery. That's not the government's job. The government shouldn't be saying that. And if in front of TV cameras, that was incredible. And then basically also saying that the quality of fuel coming out of Dangote Refinery is not good enough. Again, it's almost like the government is trying to discredit the private investments of a Nigerian, which again is incredible. So that just goes to show that there are certain elements within the Nigerian state itself who are not really aligned with the economic interests of Nigeria as a country, unfortunately.
Okay, just before we go, because we have less than a minute to wrap up, what lies ahead? You know, knowing what you know, having extensively covered this particular sector, what comes next? What is the next hurdle, whether it's for Dangote or for the Nigerian economy, to try to answer this very obvious, difficult challenge of having to navigate both domestic and external challenges?
I think what I expect will happen is that there will start to be very unnecessary logistical difficulties to actually get this thing up and running to the extent that it's supposed to. And I think Dangote has already started facing the refinery is becoming a huge issue. The NNPC is not supplying crude oil that it was supposed to supply to Dangote because it has basically mortgaged its oil production for the next 2 years or so. And Dangote is having to import cargoes from the US and wherever. So I think we're going to see more of that. And I think we're also going to see the international oil companies pulling out all the tricks in their book to try and frustrate Dangote Refinery. You might start seeing cargoes having actual issues when they're on the sea. Things like this have happened before. That's how the oil industry works. Right. But on the flip side, so that I don't end on a down on a miserable note, I also think that when you start seeing things like that, and when it becomes very obvious to everybody that Dangote Refinery is a threat to certain entrenched interests, I think that's the exact moment where the biggest opportunity exists to finally exit that primary level of production that we have been trapped in, because then it becomes more difficult to pretend as if this whole thing doesn't exist and it's a conspiracy theory, which is what people have done for decades.
Right. David, interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your insight and for all the good work that you're doing. We hope to circle back and discuss this and many more other developments in the near future as we continue to learn a lot more about the intricacies around this particular development. Thank you most kindly for taking the time and for joining us on Daily Politics.
Thank you for having me.
Right. All right. That is our offering for you on the show tonight. Thank you most kindly for your time and company. We'll be back tomorrow, live and exclusive as always on Trust TV. Until next time, my name is Abdullahi Ahmed. From myself and the rest of the team, thank you for your time. We'll see you soon.